Willkommen in einem anderen Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 24 of my game system design series of videos. In this video I will be attempting to determine the optimum scale for a set of rules, such as ground scale, time scale and optimal playing area size to use for micro armor rules, or actually Napoleonics or ancient as well. The video is intended for gamers who have an interest in game design and game system. It may not be that interesting to the general gamer, so you have been warned. When you design a set of rules or play a set of rules, you do need something to use as a foundation to ensure the rules are plausible. I feel the optimum foundation is scale. Once you set a scale, you immediately provide yourself a framework to hang the other game systems on top of. While it's possible to ignore scale and just wing it, the chances of making an error will increase, especially if you want your rules to be comparatively realistic or plausible. The only time you can consider ignoring scale is if your sole focus is playability rather than any form of realism or historical accuracy, and as a result your rules are highly abstract. While this video specifically deals with micro armor or World War II, Cold War and modern gaming, the basic principles do apply to Napoleonic and ancient gaming as well. However, due to the focus on ranged weapons, it is more significant in the world of World War II, Cold War and modern gaming. The first question we need to ask ourselves and to be answered is, how can you determine the optimum scale to use for your set of rules? The first three scales you need to determine is ground scale, time scale and element scale. I commonly use two formulas when determining game length and game scale. That is, the number of elements multiplied by some variable equals the game length, or alternatively, the element scale multiplied by the number of elements equals the game scale. Putting the formulas to one side, the scale to use is dependent on several variables you need to first define. The first variable you need to determine is how long do you want a game to take. This in turn is based on how many elements or figures or units which are on the playing area on average over the length of the game. Number of elements you select will determine how many game turns can be executed in a given time period. Other factors such as game complexity, playing area size and unit composition will have an effect. But the most significant factor is the number of elements, or elements that you move and conduct combat with, which are used on average over the length of the entire game. For those wondering what an element is, for clarity purposes, when I refer to an element, I'm referring to a game counter or piece, like a piece in a chessboard, or a base. Some rules allow for multiple figures to comprise an element, or several based figures which could be called an element, organized into, let's say, units. An element is the smallest piece or unit which you can individually move, attack with, defend, independent of any other element on the playing area. Once we know how many elements we are using, we can then determine what an element represents. Could be a squad, platoon, company or battalion. In games where an element is comprised of several figures, the calculation becomes even more complex, as we need to determine if the figures is the actual element, or if the multi-figure element is the actual physical element. This is for rules where the individual, your scale is based on the figure or the element. If the figure or base or element acts only as strength points, then it's not really an element, it's part of a unit which is the element. If the figures have more autonomy, then we need to use them as elements. So if a figure within a base or movement tray can actually move out and do things itself, then it probably is almost certainly an element. In many cases there could be a combination, but if in doubt, just use the actual elements on the playing area. With this information we can determine the game scale to use, such as ground scale, time scale and element scale. That is, exactly what does an element represent. You may ask, what is the impact of the number of elements on game length? Based on Würzburg, a board game which I played in competition many times, it took 2.5 hours to play 12 game turns. Factor in extra time for the larger micro armor playing area and we can roll this up to 3 hours. In my Würzburg example, there was a total of 94 counters or elements or units. If we include air points, we could round this up to 100 elements. The game did involve reinforcements, so we need to average out the counter mix, which now drops to an average of 75 counters for both people over the length of the game. We can say a game involving 100 elements on average takes 4 hours to play 12 game turns. This is for both players. This averages out to 20 minutes per game turn. There are other ways of calculating this, especially if the game system supports large multi-figure units, but this is a generally reasonable baseline for us to use. Based on this formula, the optimal size is a total of 100 elements, that is for both players, per game turn over the course of the entire game. In an attack and defense scenario, this could involve 50 elements attacking 25, and in the second half of the game, the defender counterattacks with an additional force of 50 elements. This averages out to 100 elements over the entire game. Depending on the number of game turns, the game will last from 2 to 4 hours. Other factors will cause this to vary, such as the complexity of the rules, but this is actually a reasonable baseline for our purposes, and what I've discovered is no matter how complex the rules are, all that means is that you've got to put more effort in learning it. If you know a complex set of rules extremely well, you can actually play them quite rapidly. The disadvantage with complex sets of rules is it takes a long time to get to that point. If we use our simple example, the attacker deploys 50 elements and the defender deploys 25 elements. Thus, the next question we need to ask ourselves is, what does an element represent? With this information, we can now determine the optimal ground scale. If an element represents a single vehicle, which is squad scale, the attacker can deploy 2 companies and the defender 1 company in this case. If the element represents a platoon, the attacker can deploy 2 battalions and the defender 1 battalion in this case. If the element represents a company, the attacker can deploy 2 regiments and the defender 1 regiment in this case. If the element represents a battalion, the attacker can deploy 4 divisions and the defender deploys 2 divisions. Now that we know what the forces that we will be fielding are, we can now calculate ground scale. I've used the formation frontages provided by Stephen Balagan, and I'll include the link at the end of the video or in the notes section. For simplicity, I've normalized the values and produced a single value representing the typical frontage for attack and defense of a particular formation. Stephen Balagan provides a range of values based on the references he is using. While this detail is far more accurate, it's too complex for our purposes. If you look at the values Stephen Balagan provides, you'll notice troop density increases as you increase the scale. This is due to the depth of the formation being factored into Stephen Balagan's values. A company would have the same frontage as a battalion, and 3 companies would have a frontage significantly greater than a battalion. Because we are dealing with the forces on the playing area, we cannot use these frontage values except as a sanity check, because the forces to the rear are not on the playing area. If we first use a scale of a company, that is a formation scale of a company, which is based on the value of 400 metres to 100 metres frontage, as provided by Stephen Balagan using the US War Department sources, let's see what we come up with. The average of these 2 values is 700 metres. The one interesting point is the frontage, even at a maximum, is the same as the range of the primary long-range weapon of this formation, an infantry regiment, the machine gun. It would be reasonable to expect at company scale there was no point in holding back reserves, as every man in the front line could support the entire formation with machine gun fire, as long as there was a line of sight. If reserves do exist, they would be in close proximity to the rear, and this is probably reflected in the frontage differences. We could say a German company, with every man in the front line, would be expected to defend 1,000 metres. However, it's equally plausible that terrain would influence frontage as well. There are too many variables, so we need to make some grand assumptions and stay with them. I'm going to assume a company can defend on average 700 metres. A quick note about attack frontage. I have not included them because they reflect even more variables than defence frontages. Instead, I'm going to use a simple principle. You need at least 2-to-1 superiority in order to attack. This could represent all the troops in the front line or in waves, but all the troops must be in close proximity. Thus, while an individual company may be able to attack across a frontage of 700 metres, it would have another company close to the rear to support it. On average, the attack frontage of this kind of attack company is about, on average, 350 metres. Let's calculate frontages using a different system to see if it aligns with our current 700 metre assumption. This is more of a verification of my assumption. In this case, we're looking at the frontage a German division would be expected to hold in 1940 using German sources. This table shows the frontage of a German infantry division in 1940. The first line assumes that the two regiments are in the front line, each with a battalion reserve, and there is a reserve regiment. This means each regiment has a frontage of 4,500 metres, and as this only consists of two battalions, each battalion has a frontage of 2,250 metres. If we look at company densities, there are 12 companies in the front line. Thus, the company frontage is 750 metres, which is very close to my earlier 700 metre assumption or estimate. In the second example, we assume either all three regiments in the front line and each one has a reserve battalion, or two regiments are in the front line and there is only a reserve regiment. In this situation, we have 18 companies in the front line, each with a frontage of 750 metres. Amazing coincidence. In the last assumption, we assume no reserves, although in practice there was always a divisional level battalion to act as some form of reserves, particularly Germans in the Eastern Front. This defence line assumes typical terrain, so if there were significant natural barriers such as a river, the line could be much longer. However, it was rarely so long that the divisional artillery could not support the entire division, so a reasonable maximum frontage would be double those shown above. In most typical games, we do not have any major natural defences. If we did, it would be a very specific scenario, which would not be a typical game, such as a river crossing. In all three situations that I showed earlier, the frontages of a company remains roughly the same, about 750 metres. The only difference is how much reinforcements you have, which in any initial situation could be or would normally be none. Reinforcements would arrive in later game turns and could be the basis of a counterattack. Let's look at the problem from the other end, the actual game. Number of elements and playing area. The defender has 25 elements, of which some will occupy rear positions. This leaves us a maximum of 20 elements, 3 centimetres wide, which could form a line 60 centimetres long. While it is possible to have more than one line of elements, such as 2 deep, this may not be aesthetically appealing. As a result, we can state the minimum width of a playing area should be 60 centimetres, preferably more as part of the frontage will be occupied by terrain. We would be aiming for a playing area width of at least 90 centimetres. The frontage can be greater, but what we are attempting to identify is the ideal playing area scale or game scale. A player can simply double any ideal scale to achieve lower densities if they so desire. If we're using a scale of 1 in 1,000, then 60 centimetres becomes 600 metres. If all the elements were in the front line, it becomes 750 metres. The range of 600 metres to 900 metre frontage for a company begins to match Stephen Balagan's frontage range for a German company, where Stephen Balagan states a maximum frontage is 1,000 metres in some cases, which, we can understand could be possible in this case, so we need to cater for that. Based on, our current analysis, and hopefully I haven't confused everyone, the following scales would apply to a squad scale set of rules. That is, every element represents an individual figure, or possibly a platoon or squad. At squad scale, the company would defend at least 600 metres, and two companies would be able to attack across a frontage of at least 600 metres. If we pick a scale of 1 in 1,000, the playing area width is 60 centimetres. To cater for terrain, the playing area should be at least 90 centimetres wide. It should be noted, these scales are for World War II. Modern conflicts have a lower unit density, so we would typically use a ground scale of 2,000 to 1 in those cases. This is commonly done by many sets of squad scale sets of rules. This presentation will assume a World War II period, but you should increase ground scale for modern conflicts. And when I talk about ground scale, I mean 1 in 1,000, 1 in 2,000, because that will determine your fire combat range. Let's look at the depth of the playing area. British records showed that a typical advance against prepared defences is 500 metres. This was a prepared infantry attack against a prepared infantry defence at 3 to 1 odds over a duration of a day, possibly 5 to 10 hours. A typical squad scale set of rules would span 60 minutes. In this case, we may expect an advance of 100 metres. This represents an advance of 10 centimetres if we use a playing area scale of 1 in 1,000. Doesn't sound particularly exciting, does it? Because typically in a game we're using lower densities of troops than the British analysis that I provide, we could assume any advance would be probably greater. I must admit this is a guess, and I could be completely wrong, but an advance of 100 metres or 10 centimetres at a 1 in 1,000 scale does not represent much mobility when we consider the duration of a typical squad scale set of rules or game. If we assume our lower densities result in a doubling of the advance, we are left with 200 metres or 20 centimetres if we're using a scale of 1 in 1,000. Bit more interesting. If each player has a player area of 500 metres, that is in depth, this gives us a total play area depth of 1200 metres, or 120 centimetres at 1 to 1000 scale. If we move up to platoon scale, which means we're dealing with battalions, we have the following frontages. If a battalion consists of 3 companies, each of which can defend 750 metres, then our battalion frontage is 2,250 metres. For simplicity, I'm rounding this up to 2,400 metres. This is in order to keep our numbers nice and simple. At a platoon scale, a battalion, that is, each element represents a platoon, a battalion would defend 2,400 metres, and 2 battalions would attack across a frontage of 2,400 metres. If we pick a scale of 1 in 4,000, the playing area width is 60 centimetres. To cater for terrain, the playing area should be at least 90 centimetres wide, if not wider. I must point out I'm conducting some reverse engineering here, as many platoon scale rules use a ground scale of 1 in 4,000. And that seems to work generally, at least in my personal experience. For modern conflict, we may consider a scale in 1 in 8,000, which is not that common for these sort of rules, but nonetheless should probably be considered. In a modern period, troop densities were less and weapon ranges much greater, which is why you should consider this change in scale for moderns. When we look at the depth of a playing area, a platoon scale game could span the 5 hours required to advance 500 metres, or 12.5 centimetres, scale of 1 in 4,000. At a lower density, this becomes 1,000 metres, or 25 centimetres, a scale of 1 in 4,000. Apply our playing area of 50 centimetres, and our table depth is, once again, 120 centimetres. It would be possible to have a reduced depth, as a player area could be as little as 30 centimetres, which gives us a total depth for the entire playing area of 90 centimetres, which is probably more optimal. When we move to company scale, we're dealing with regiments. A regiment has 9 companies in the front line, which gives us a frontage of 6,750 metres. I'll round this up to 7,200 metres to ensure we stay with nice, simple values. At company scale, a regiment could defend 7,200 metres, and 2 regiments could attack across the frontage of 7,200 metres. If we pick a scale of 1 in 10,000, the playing area width is 72 centimetres. To cater for terrain, the playing area width should be at least 90 centimetres wide. This assumes no reserves, although in reality a regiment does possess organic reserve assets, which could be allocated out to the battalions, or kept in reserve if the troop type was appropriate. If we use our standard depth calculation, even if doubling for spanning 2 days, we find the distance is very small, coupled with the reduced need for play area, and we have a problem. The answer is that this scale in advance probably would result in a breakthrough, which involves much greater advances, thus we get a more exciting game. A playing area depth of 120 centimetres is probably still required at this scale in order to cater for these breakthroughs, although I found for practice 90 centimetres is normally more than adequate. Based on my analysis, and perhaps I'm going a little bit overboard, the playing area should be probably 90 centimetres by 120 centimetres, which with play occurring along the long axis. Players can always halve the scale, so for platoon scale we move up to 1 in 2,000 scale, thus doubling the playing area size. This is also making several assumptions about game length, which is reasonably conclusive. However, I must point out that while I began most of my games playing along the long axis, in this case that's 120 centimetres, I've generally moved to playing along the short axis, 90 centimetres, because I find the greater width gives both players more flexibility in terms of hitting flanks, etc., and makes for a more interesting game, even if advances may not be that great. It's all up to do with player preference. Regardless of exactly what playing area size we decide upon, the key takeaway is the playing area most games use, or most rules use, is probably far larger than the typical frontage taken up by the troops that you would typically field. The width and depth is explained away by the type of game, which could be in this case an attack and defence game, occurring after a breakthrough. Thus, we would expect more movement, possibly. Most squad scale rules use a scale of 1 in 1000 to 1 in 2000, with the former being most common in World War II, latter Cold War, etc. Most platoon scale rules use a scale of 1 in 4000, and most company scale rules use a scale of 1 in 5000 to 1 in 10,000, generally erring on the 1 in 10,000, with the average being probably 1 in 7500. Battalion scale rules use a ground scale of between 1 in 7,000 and 1 in 24,000, so they vary a lot. These ranges are based on actual sets of rules, not what I consider is optimal. If we want to look at an optimal ground scale, let's look at this chart. This is highly subjective, but based on the element scale, our desire to have a game which can complete in a day and typical troop densities, a number of optimal scales do tend to arise based on the element scale. I have based this on common sets of rules, as well as considering the maths I have done earlier. My main issue is the scale for modern platoon scale rules, which tends not to be a common scale among real rules out there. That is, modern 1 in 8000. That's pretty rare for platoon. However, I did read on the Yahoo groups for FFT3, or Fistful of Toe 3, the designer, after creating his rules, claimed he wished he had increased the scale used for modern conflicts, doubling it. So perhaps what I'm showing here is the optimal scale, which most rules designers don't consider. It's just that no one has selected it yet because it's easier to use the same scale for World War II and modern conflicts if your rules span both periods. Going into rules techniques, one interesting technique used by many rules is to provide all distance values as a number, allowing players to use centimetres or inches based on their personal preference. The inches distance would be typically used for 15 mil figures. The playing area would still need to fit within a typical table, so using inches, we would not translate into 90 inches by 120 inch table. We would still use probably our trusty 6 feet by 8 feet or 72 inches by 96 inch playing area. But on the table we would be using inches to measure out movement, etc., which is why we should always err on the side of lower density troops on a playing area. There is also another consideration when we look at ground scale and time scale. A foot can cover 5 kilometres an hour if there are no enemy around or opposition. If there is enemy around, this drops dramatically, and under fire drops even further. There is a US Army analysis of this, which I cover in more detail later in this video series, but this chart shows a simplified summary of this. This basically shows that movement rate of foot in clear terrain is 500 metres per hour. When we're a long way from the enemy, this drops to 1,000 when we get closer, and only 500 metres per hour when we're actually in combat with enemy troops. Based on that chart, in most cases, movement rates provided in rules would possibly use the middle value, that is, close to the enemy but not under fire, or 1,000 metres per hour. Thus, if the ground scale is 1 in 1,000, the time scale is 6 minutes, infantry could cover 10 centimetres in a game turn. 10 centimetres represents 100 metres. Troops under fire would have a movement rate of 5 centimetres per game turn, and troops in the rear could travel up to 50 centimetres in a game turn. This is actually reasonable movement values. Let's apply this simple formula to all our element scales and see what we get. This shows the optimum ground time scale. The 10 centimetres for infantry represents foot moving in clear terrain with no enemy opposition, but with enemy within 5 kilometres. In most cases, rules give infantry a movement allowance of 5 centimetres, but with travel modes or road movement rates which allow this to be doubled or even more. When there is enemy very close, this would drop to 5 centimetres per game turn. The distance is average, and a person walking along the street carrying nothing could travel up to 50 centimetres. However, troops carrying a lot of stuff over a period, it's different. They quickly tire and tend to be cautious when they move around, knowing that there's someone out there ready to shoot at them. Also, any unit moves at the speed of the slowest person. And so we come to a conclusion of episode 24 of my video on micro armour game system design, in this case determining the optimal scale to use for a game or to use for designing a set of rules. I have to admit, in this video I haven't actually come up with any solid conclusions for people to use. What I've basically done is run through the things that you need to consider when you're determining scale for your set of rules. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.